Okay, so in this lecture, I want to talk about divine command theory. Um, and divine command theory is, just a fancy way of putting a thought about morality or a way of thinking about morality that I think, a fair number of people might have. And divine command theory is this idea that, you know, morality is entirely a result of God's commands. You know, what's the right thing to do, whatever God says to do, what's wrong, what God tells us not to do. So I think it's worth, saying a bit before we start out about different types of moral theory. And divine command theory is what I'm going to call a rules-based theory. Um, Sometimes when you look at this in other settings, if you do more philosophy, people will call these deontological theories. Don't worry about that term. I don't know why we use it. It's just a fancy way of putting this idea of a rules-based theory. And a rules-based theory says, well, how do you know what the right thing to do is? How do you judge what other people do? Well, you look at certain moral rules. Do your actions follow the moral rules, the things you're thinking about doing? Do they fit with what the moral rules tell you to do? If so, then do them. Do they conflict with the moral rules? Then, well, you shouldn't do them. And the same goes when you look at the actions of other people. Do those actions fit the moral rules? Then those are good things to do. Are they against the moral rules? Well, then people shouldn't do those things. And of course, a lot of things might be in the middle. No moral rule might cover it. Then it's not bad or good, right? Any good theory with moral rules is going to say, well, murder's wrong, so murder is a bad thing to do. Helping others, you should do that, at least in some cases. That's a good thing to do. Getting a cup of coffee, unless you tell me some other story, it's neither good or bad. The rules just don't cover it. There's a lot of things that won't be covered by the rules. So divine command theory, which I'll talk about today, and which, I'll argue for reasons we look at today, won't be that important a moral theory for this course. Well, divine command theory is a sort of rules-based theory. God sets the rules. Kantianism, which we will spend a lot more time on going forward, is another kind of rules-based theory. We'll talk more about that. Just know that both divine command theory and Kantianism work in terms of moral rules. Now, another sort of theory is what we might call consequentialism. And we've already looked at one consequentialist theory, ethical egoism. We'll look at another one, utilitarianism. And what it is to call a theory consequentialist is that the theory judges actions in terms of their consequences. What's the right thing to do? Whatever has good consequences. What's the wrong thing to do? Well, it's whatever has bad consequences. Now, when you hear something like that, of course, the next question you ought to be asking, well, what are good consequences and what are bad consequences? Well, different forms of consequentialism will answer that question in really different ways. Ethical egoism, if you think back, it says, well, good consequences are whatever is good for me, bad consequences are whatever is bad for me. Well, utilitarianism won't work out consequences in those terms. It won't be a form of ethical egoism, but utilitarianism will also focus on consequences. That is, what your actions bring about, what happens because of what you do. Both moral rules and consequences are natural ways to think about morality, right? If I ask you why you did something, why did you return a wallet to somebody? You might cite either rules or consequences. You might say, well, look, we ought to help other people out when we can do so without, really hurting ourselves. Finding this person, calling him or her up, getting their wallet back to him, that didn't really put me out that much, and it really helped him. You might also say, well, you should never steal other people's money unless there's a really good reason. So I can't just take the money from this wallet and keep it, right? That would be stealing. I certainly don't have a good reason for that. I shouldn't do it. You might also cite consequences, right? You might say, well, you know, getting this person's money back to them, getting their ID back to them, it really, really helped them out. Those are good consequences. It makes their life go so much better. Doesn't hurt me, so no bad consequences really. I do it because what happens. So hopefully that distinction's fairly clear to you guys. We'll talk a lot more about it, and there's a lot of variation in rules-based theories, what they say the rules are, how they work them out. The same goes for consequentialism. But just know that these are two broad approaches to how to think about morality. Later in the semester, we'll talk about virtue theory. Virtue theory is yet another approach to morality. Just for now, know rules-based theories and consequentialist theories. Well, look, your reading doesn't talk much about this because it doesn't get deeper into rules-based theories, but since we're going to be talking a lot about Kantianism and it's a rules-based theory, and these questions also apply to divine command theory, I think they're useful things to keep in mind. I think we should think about the kinds of questions we want or we should want a rules-based theory to answer. And I think the biggest of those are sort of two questions or two sets of questions. So first of these, how do we know what the moral rules are? If I say to you, well, you shouldn't steal, you should help others, you might say, well, okay, how do you know what those moral rules are? How do I, if I come across a situation that's new even, how do I know what the moral rules are there? Second, why are the rules so important? I tell you you should do this, even in some cases where it might end up hurting you, or it might not be very fun, give the person their wallet back, even though that's going to be annoying, even though you could keep the money and it would help you out. So given all that, why should I follow the rules? Why are the rules important? Good rules-based theory ought to be able to give us an answer and a good answer to both these questions. So divine command theory, as I've said before, basically just the thought that God's commands create the rules. God tells us to do something, that's the moral rule, we should do it. God tells us not to do something, that's a moral rule against it, we shouldn't do it. So divine command theory says the right thing to do equals whatever God commands us to do, wrong equals whatever God forbids. God says, don't steal, then stealing is wrong. God says, help your neighbor out, then helping your neighbor is the right thing to do. Okay, so how does divine command theory fare as a moral theory? Well, it faces a huge problem, and your reading talks about this problem. This is called the Euthyphro Dilemma because it was first posed by Plato in this dialogue, the Euthyphro, over 2,000 years ago. Plato doesn't quite talk about it in modern terms, but this seems to be pretty clearly the dilemma that he has in mind. And so the idea is, well, the divine command theorist says, well, right things are what God commands, wrong things are what God forbids. Euthyphro Dilemma then asks the divine command theorist a question. So it says, well, look, are right actions right and wrong actions wrong only because God commands and forbids them? So in option one, if you say stealing is wrong, murder is wrong, helping your neighbor out is right, there's nothing more to explain that than that God commands or forbids them. If I say, why is murder wrong? You say, well, God tells us not to do it. And I say, well, but isn't there more to it than that? You say, nope, that's all there is to it. All it is for something to be wrong is God says don't do it. God commands us not to do it. Why is it right to help your neighbor? Well, because God tells us to do that. No more in the way of explanation than that. 2, well, if you take option 2, then it's not that things are right or wrong only because God commands them. In fact, option 2 would say that actually gets things in reverse. Option 2 says, well, certain things are right or wrong independently of what God might command, and God commands them or forbids them because they're right and wrong. Stealing is wrong independently of what God might command, but God sees that it's wrong, so God commands us not to steal. Murder is wrong independently of anything God might command, but God sees that murder is wrong, so he tells us not to do it. Helping others out, good thing in and of itself, independently of what God might command or not command, but God sees it's good, so he tells us to do it. So either of these options, though, seems to create a problem for divine command theory. And I'll go through these. Option 2, I'll say a little bit more about now, and I'll say a bit about the end. Option 2 seems to create a problem because it seems like divine commands aren't really what's important. If you take option 2, then, well, divine commands aren't important. It seems like you're already stepping out of a divine command theory. Why is that? Well, because if you take option 2, what's important when I say stealing is wrong isn't just that God commands it, it's whatever facts about stealing make God, or, are the reason that God forbids it. So if I say murder is wrong on option 2, well, the important thing then isn't that God forbids murder, it's whatever reasons he has for forbidding murder. Thing about 2 is, seems like you could give an account of murder being wrong or stealing wrong without ever bringing God into it. So, seems like you'll have stepped away from divine command theory. If there's some independent reason that murder is wrong, say that it hurts others, something like that, well, then it seems like you could just bring that up without ever talking about God's commands. So divine command theorists might not like 2 because it seems like once you take option 2, you're already moving away from a divine command theory because God's commands are no longer essential, or so it seems. So a lot of divine command theorists will want to take option 1. Well, what's wrong with option 1, right? I say there's a dilemma here. Not a dilemma if you have one bad choice and one good one. Only a dilemma if you have 2 bad choices, and for the divine command theorist, it does look like there are 2 bad choices here. Well, there are 2 problems with option 1, or perhaps 3. It kind of depends on how you slice it. First 2 kind of fold into each other, but I think they're worth talking about separately. So I'm going to go through 3 different problems with option 1. First problem is morality becomes arbitrary. If there's no deeper reason for what God commands or forbids than he commands or forbids it, well, then it seems like God could command anything. Murder's wrong now because God forbids it. Stealing is wrong because God forbids it. But if he changes his mind tomorrow and says, we'll go steal and murder, then stealing and murder would be the right thing to do. That seems like a problem. Second thing here is, well, there seems to be no way you could sort out what are legitimate divine commands from false ones. Most of us, even those of us who are believers, probably think that there are certain things God wouldn't command. You know, if we hear a booming voice from the sky telling us to do something and it's just awful or just crazy, we wouldn't do it. There's certain things God might command, certain things that he wouldn't. The first sort of thing, well, if we hear a booming voice telling us to go help the poor half a world away, that might be a possible divine command. At least if you're a believer, that might be a possibility. If you hear a booming voice saying, go burn down the bus station, well, even if you're a believer, you probably think someone's pulling an elaborate prank on me or something's gone wrong. I shouldn't go burn down the bus stop, right? Finally, if divine command theory's right, if option one's right, then if there isn't a God, if God doesn't exist, then morality doesn't exist. And it also seems if option one's right, that anyone who denies God's existence would have to deny that there's any such thing as morality. If you say God doesn't exist and divine command theory is right, then you ought to just say that there's no reason not to murder or steal or do anything no matter how horrible. Problem is, whether you're a believer or not, if you've known atheists, I mean, some atheists might be jerks, some of them might be completely moral people, well, that seems at odds with what divine command theory says. I've known some atheists who were not just moral people, but really, really good people. How do you fit that with divine command theory? Okay, so let's go through each of these options in a little more detail. So look, for the first option, let me just run through to just bring home how problematic it is. Let me run through in more detail an example that your reading goes through kind of quickly. So the idea is, if divine command theory is true, then anything God commands would be the morally right thing to do, but certain things couldn't be morally right no matter what. Your reading just uses X. I've filled it in with a more memorable example, boiling a baby alive. Look, don't complain that I have a sick mind. I take this example from Elizabeth Anscombe. I rip it off just because it is a memorable example. So look, if you're a morally decent person, you probably think that boiling a baby alive wouldn't be a good thing to do, wouldn't be morally right, no matter what. Hopefully you think that. Well, the problem is, if divine command theory is true, it could be. So if DCT is true, whatever, DCT being divine command theory, then whatever God commands is the morally right thing to do. God could command that we boil a baby alive. So if divine command theory is true, boiling a baby alive could be the morally right thing to do. Boiling a baby alive could not be the morally right thing to do, so divine command theory isn't true. Look, fill this in with whatever horrible thing you want. Rape, genocide, murder, anything can go in here. And I think you would think, well, we know these things are wrong. But divine command theory says, well, they could be the right thing to do if God commanded them. Well, that doesn't seem right. Think about this a little more deeply. If you're a believer, a response, or if you just want to help the theory out, a response you might go for is to say, well, God wouldn't command those sorts of things. Well, then the follow-up question is, well, why wouldn't he? Why wouldn't God command those things? And your answer is probably like, well, those are terrible things, and God is good. But notice if you give that reply, what you're doing. Divine command theory wants to define good and bad entirely in terms of what God commands. Good is just whatever God commands, bad is whatever he forbids. So if you talk about God being good, that can't mean anything besides God commands what he commands, forbids what he forbids, right? If you want to talk about God being good, then you need some independent account of goodness that doesn't fall back on God's commands. And if you start to do that, you're moving away from option one. If You start to do that if you start to explain, the goodness of God. If you say, well, God doesn't like to see people suffer without, suffering is bad and God is good, so God wants people to be happy. Well, you're already starting to bring in notions of goodness and badness that don't depend entirely on God's will. So you're already moving away from option one. And I think we should think about a deeper problem for option one, which is, look, it doesn't seem to give us a good moral reason why the rules are important. If I say, well, you shouldn't steal because God commands us not to steal, well, you might ask, why is it so important to do what God commands? Now, look, some people might say, well, because if you don't, he'll punish you in some way. That doesn't seem to give you a good moral reason to do it, right? If I say you ought to return a wallet you found on the ground because, well, if you take the money, you might always get caught for stealing it. It might be true. I haven't given you a good moral reason to do it, though, it doesn't seem, right? There's also a problem when it comes to the second question. So, look, on the the first question, second question of why are God's commands important? First question, how do we know what the commands are? Well, look, a divine command theorist, your reading doesn't really talk about this, but a divine command theorist will probably say, well, you know what God commands through some sort of revelation. Either God himself tells you, or more likely he tells somebody else, and that person gives you the revelation, right? Well, the problem here, though, is, well, look, there are a lot of things that people might say God told them, or we might even think God's told us something. We'll want to sort out legitimate revelations from things that are just another person trying to take advantage of us, or maybe us in some way going crazy, right? But look, if you're a divine command theorist of the first sort, if there's nothing to say about why God commands what he commands, then you can't really rule out revelations that might be crazy. If the booming voice tells me to go burn down the bus stop, well, I think either someone's pulling a prank on me, or maybe, I need to see a doctor. But why is that? I say, well, God wouldn't command that. Well, if I'm a divine command theorist of option one, then I can't give any good reason for thinking God wouldn't command that. There's no reason for what God commands. He just commands what he does. So why rule out option one? Why rule out crazy commands? Even believers are going to want to do that. So it seems a good reason not to go with option one. Finally, there's the fact that atheists can be moral. And there's not just the fact that atheists can be moral, but it looks like that atheists and believers can have arguments about what's the morally right thing to do. So look, if divine command theory of the first sort were true, if there's nothing more to be said about morality than what God commands, then if you say that God doesn't exist, then you've just denied morality completely. So if divine command theory of the first sort's true, it seems like if you're an atheist, morality is just something that doesn't exist. So if divine command theory of the first sort's true, then it seems like an atheist can't be a moral person. An atheist would have to deny that morality exists at all. Problem is, that doesn't seem to be true. So the argument is, if divine command theory is true, no one who denies God's existence could be a moral person, meaning a morally decent person. Atheists, by definition, deny God's existence. So if divine command theory is true, no atheist can be a moral person. But some atheists are moral people. There are at least some, we're not arguing about how many, but as long as there's some, this argument's not going to work. Or sorry, this claim's not going to work. So finally, so divine command theory is not true. And there's another issue here too, which is, well, look, theists, a theist being someone who believes in God, and atheists can debate morality. If divine command theory of the first sort were true, that doesn't seem to be possible. Seems like the theist would have to be talking about God's commands. The atheist and him wouldn't even have any grounds to agree on, right? If the believer says, well, stealing is wrong because God says don't do it, well, then the atheist and the believer couldn't even have an argument about whether stealing was right or wrong or when it was okay to steal. We have those arguments all the time. Atheists and believers, they can at least have a discussion about morality. Divine command theory says that they couldn't. Well, that's yet more reason not to buy option one, this version of divine command theory that says God commands what he commands. There's no reason behind it. So the consensus is it's better to take option two. Option two being that there's some reason or reasons. If God does command and forbid certain things, there are reasons that explain why he commands what he commands, forbids what he forbids. It's not just that God tells us not to commit murder. We can cite a reason besides what God commands that God would command us not to commit murder. It hurts other people. We wouldn't want it done to us. Once we bring in reasons like that, we're no longer, strictly speaking, a divine command theorist because we're no longer trying to account for what is right and wrong in terms of God's commands. So then why would anybody take option one? Why would anybody be a divine command theorist? As your reading points out, even among believers, the divine command option hasn't been the majority option. For most of history, very few Christian thinkers took a really strict form of divine command theory. Well, the reason I think divine command theory might be popular among believers is that if you don't go with divine command theory, if you start citing independent reasons for what God commands and forbids, then it seems like, well, maybe you're pushing God aside. Maybe he won't have a role in morality anymore. I'm not sure that that's true. I'll talk more about this when we talk about Kant, but it seems that there are plenty of roles God might play in morality, even if right and wrong isn't solely up to what he decides, right? You might even give revelation, God revealing moral truths to us a role, right? Well, if there's independent facts about right and wrong, if God exists, he's much smarter than we are. He might know things that we don't. So given what he knows, he might reveal moral truths to us because we might not be smart enough to get them, or it might take us a lot longer. So there might still be a role for divine commands telling us what to do when we would have taken a lot longer to get to it. Or even an option two, look, we might think it's important that there's justice in the universe. God might be a sort of judge, right? The judge doesn't make the law, but he applies it. God might exist. He might be the one who gives people their just deserts for following the rules or not following the rules. Kant seems to think of God in that sense, God as a sort of judge. we'll see how well that works. But hopefully I've given you guys a sense of the problems with option one and why we would take option two. So what does this all mean? Well, I think what this all means is that, even for believers, we can't just fall back on what God says or what God doesn't say or what God forbids. But even if we step away from this sort of more abstract, high-flown things going on in this discussion of divine command theory, I think there's a good reason for this, right? Look, in a society like ours, if we're going to make moral claims, we need to be able to make claims that we think people will accept, even if they don't agree with us on every bit of religion, right? If you start making your moral claims dependent on God's commands, well, there's a good chance the other person's not going to agree with you, right? He might say, well, I just don't think God exists, so who cares about these supposed commands? He might say, well, okay, I'm a believer too, but I don't think you guys have got any legitimate revelation from God, so why should I care what you say, what God's told you to do, because I know that you guys are wrong. Or they might just say, well, I don't know that God exists. Well, so if he doesn't, if he has, maybe you guys are right. If he doesn't, he couldn't have said anything to you. But even if he does, he might not have said anything to your particular group. So I don't know. You might be right, but you've not given me a great reason, right? So look, if we're going to make moral claims that have any grasp on people who don't agree with us completely on religious matters, we don't want to fall back on divine command theory. That in itself, beyond all these high-flown, abstract, clever philosophers' reasons, that's a reason we probably don't want to be divine command theorists when it comes to morality.